Hello, everyone. Welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I am Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined as always by Charlie Araujo. How are you, Charlie?
I'm doing great. And in fact, I don't know if anyone can tell, I'm sporting brand new glasses, but they look just like my old ones, so you can't tell.
Very
That's
sneaky.
my big news. I know exactly.
Excellent. So, the past week, although we're heading into the dog days of summer, we've actually been seeing a lot of funding announcements, a lot of new types of new companies that are representing new areas of new markets, new capabilities, and new approaches to taking on enterprise applications that each are a little interesting in their own right. And I'm going to start by digging into the emergence funding. So, a company called Emergence recently came out of stealth, announcing about $100 million in equity funding and then some access to some additional debt. And of course, the founders have appropriate enterprise bona fides showing that they understand enterprise applications. But it's what really seemed to be most interesting about their approach is that they are looking at more than one model. They are hedging their bets and looking like they want to help enterprises with the future of AI. And I'm curious what you saw there, Charlie.
Well, I think it's we have a bunch of these, so we won't spend too much time on any one of them. But I think you're going to recognize the theme if you're watching this week, and that is a whole lot of talk of AI agents, a whole lot of talk of multiple models, a whole lot of talk about these intersections. And in this case, their first product, they've got, I think, some grander ambitions, but their first product is an orchestrator, effectively helping move a request or a prompt into the right model. And I think what we're seeing, so I'll preface this whole thing. I think we're going to hit this theme over and over again, is this idea that we are rapidly reaching a point, both I think within the enterprise from an application perspective, but also from a funding perspective and how who's getting funded, where the focus is shifting towards this idea of how do we operationalize this? How do we turn this stuff into reality? And I think this is one of those cases. I think the hard part is this the right one? Is it, this is, my big takeaway when I looked at it was this is pretty narrow, right? This is a very specific set of things that they're doing. It seems like one of those companies that is, begging to be acquired. So I guess we'll see how that plays out. But
Yeah. But I also think it's interesting that we're already getting into the integration phase. So of course we have data integration, we have application integration, and both of those markets are multi-billion dollar mature markets that have proven their value because we have so many different types of data and so many different types of applications. And now we're going to see that we have enough large language models and perhaps small language models and other discrete and bespoke models that we are going to have to figure out how to make some of these play together as well over time. So it'll be interesting to see this orchestrator market come
but
out
we're
because
gonna be
they're all
talking.
be
Yeah,
competitive.
we're going to be talking about this more later. I think that what this is also indicative of is this is an entire market development cycle, the hype cycle on steroids. We are going at just breakneck paces here, and I think probably in at least in some cases, unjustifiably so. Right. So it is interesting that we're already at that point of integration, and I'm not 100% confident that the market is in fact ready for that. I think we're seeing this sort of two different paces. You're seeing the tech companies that are plowing ahead and they're recognizing, I think rightfully recognizing what the future challenges will be, the ability to do agentic type approaches, the ability to drive that integration. But the actual uptake of deployment and operationalization within the enterprise is still way, 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 way behind that. And so I think that's going to create a clash. And I think that's, I don't want to say use the B word and say bubble, but I do think there's going to be some shaking out in terms of the timing and the mismatch there.
Well, we're already seeing some of the primary model companies start to blow up, companies that have raised hundreds of millions of dollars only to find that there's no market for what they do. And then they seem to get acqui-hired by Microsoft or Google at the end of the
Somebody,
day
right?
because everybody needs the AI talent anyways. So they're willing to pay that premium. But we're definitely seeing a bunch of these companies popping up that are trying to just bring multiple things together. So for instance, another one that we saw last week was a company called Creatio. They're a CRM company. They just raised $200 million at over a $1.2 billion valuation to try to bring a lot of applications together to create CRM. So, not that I get super excited about CRM to be honest, but this idea of bringing together the CRM suite from the 20, 30, 40, 50 best in breed apps that you might already be using is definitely a fundamentally different approach than what we've been sold as enterprise apps in the past couple decades.
I think it is very, very indicative of this shift that we are seeing. So Creatio, I'm a big fan of theirs. They've been doing a lot of really interesting stuff for a long time. They've been fiercely independent. So this is a market departure for them of taking this funding. And the other big shift is their messaging is now CRM and workflow automation. They are clearly trying to broaden out and be more than CRM. They're mostly focusing on front of office type applications. But I do think it speaks to the fact that we are entering this era where organizations are attempting to drive automation across every aspect of their organization, and really in many ways as a precursor to the AI enablement of those processes. And so we're going to see a lot of it, right? Disclosure, the companies I'm working with is Symphony AI, also a workflow automation tool, focus more back office. But there's a long pedigree of this. People like ServiceNow, Salesforce, you can argue their Force platform, all of these elements that have been about this automation. So I think we're entering this sort of new era around all of that, where this is becoming the driving force. And if I had to bet, and I have not been briefed by Creatio, but if I had to bet, it's that's what they're seeing, and they recognize that they're going to have a good chunk of funding to really kind of go after that space. So I think it's an interesting move. I think it's a good move for them, and I think it is definitely indicative of where we're seeing the market evolve.
Yeah, I find it interesting that they are in the middle of two hot spaces. Of course, you have HubSpot and other modern CRMs on the one side, and then you have the service workflow side, where obviously ServiceNow has been making hay. But we've also seen how ServiceNow has actually struggled with certain capabilities as well. So for instance, analytics and some of what we might call traditional AI, both areas where ServiceNow doesn't necessarily do a great job of providing outputs because it's very focused on automating workflows. And then you end up needing some additional application to go along with ServiceNow to support that. So it'll be interesting to see how Creatio balances those two, both the need to do traditional CRM type reporting as well as the interest in being able to take on that big workflow market that is where billions of dollars are just waiting to be spent.
Well, I do think it's interesting because I think that we are going to see a distinction, at least to an extent, between the back office functionality, which is of course where ServiceNow plays, where Symphony AI is playing, right? All of that, and then the front office, which has largely been immune to it, right? Has not. We've seen much more of these bespoke stovepipe sort of application stacks. So there's another company, right? Zoho, at their recent Zoholics, they also sort of doubled down on this. They've long been viewed as if you compare them to say Salesforce, much more flexible, much more adaptable. Users can do a lot more. Well, they have a product, or I guess it's a feature called Blueprint, that has historically been within the CRM, and it's a workflow tool effectively to build elements of a workflow automation. I don't think it's as robust as what Creatio is doing, or of a general workflow automation tool, but it has that. And what's interesting is they sort of exported that, at least from a branding perspective, where you can now do Blueprint in many other elements of their suite for the same purpose, for this idea of how do you drive that level of flexibility across this application stack that is CRM and marketing automation and HR and all these other tools. And I think it's interesting sort of space that we're reaching, where organizations are realizing they need more control, and they don't necessarily want to have armies of developers. And so I think it was a pretty big funding round for a company like Creatio, and so I think it is very indicative of where the market momentum around this.
Yeah, and we're seeing these shifts happening in what are theoretically considered more mature spaces as well. So another round that happened last week was around Hebbia, raising about $100 million to support AI-powered document search. And their thing is they are trying to bridge the gap between traditional search and then basically what the LLMs are doing in sucking in billions and billions of words. They're trying to be somewhere in the middle, saying that you have all these documents in your company already, often being managed by some sort of document management or content management suite, but you can't necessarily search every single word and every single detail of every single document. So they're kind of trying to come into this middle. And I actually think that's an interesting space because right now it feels like we're trying to ask LLMs to do too much. We want them to both be good at language, but also somehow also be our search engine and our analytics, and to do traditional compute capabilities that are much more binary and traditionally computational in nature.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with this organization, so I read this with fascination, mostly because it does land right smack in the middle of sort of two domains, and I'm not clear if that is because this is the emergent space, or if it's going to be like my tennis coach taught me that being in the middle is no man's land. And you're just going to get squashed and lose on both ends. Because I'm not sure, right? On the one hand, I agree. I think that we've been talking a lot about the fact that we're going to see this an adjustment, a realignment, as people get co-pilot fatigue. They don't want to have to deal with 6 million different agents and interfaces to solve their problem. So one LLM, one co-pilot to rule them all, makes a lot of sense, right? I can just go ask it this. But as we'll talk about in a little bit with some other stories, that is often easier said than done. And then the other end of the spectrum, there's an entire class of organizations that have focused on this sort of enterprise grade search capabilities, people like Elastic or Algolia, that to me, I look and say, well, is it really a stretch? They've already got all the foundation of the semantic layer and authoritative data sources. If I just add some AI, generative AI to that, wouldn't that make more sense? And so I'm fascinated by this. I don't have an answer. I think this speaks more than anything else to, if you're a CIO today, the complexity with this, that you're trying to solve problems. I appreciated Hebbia's, I think that's how they say it, origin story. I love anybody who comes to market saying, I had a very specific problem that I needed to solve and nothing was solving it, so we created a solution to solve it. That gave me confidence in what they're doing. But I think it's this really interesting dynamic space, and it's hard to see if this is really going to be the path.
Yeah, but I do think we have to figure out these areas of analytics, search, AI, and start, unfortunately, perhaps creating some silos again in terms of figuring out where our investments go in each of those areas, because it's so easy to blend these and get lost. I don't think the answer is to strictly define each of these as absolute monolithic silos, but I do think there needs to be some idea of understanding how you're going to deal with your documents, to what extent your interfaces with your applications are going to be AI-based versus traditional. All the things have to be set as some sort of policy or some sort of direction in your company, or else it is going to be very easy for everyone to try to do everything with everything and to get really lost in that process.
Yeah, and I think what it's going to come down to, and obviously we've been talking about the challenges of Gen AI hallucinations for a long time, but I think this, in this particular case, right, their origin story talks about the need to go through SEC filings, and this very complex, but the search where there's no margin of error, and so it's one of those cases where traditional approaches to Gen AI are obviously going to be challenged by that. So I think we'll see, which, and this is not something we talked about talking about, but there's also in the news, sort of outside of the enterprise space, is all the challenges that Perplexity has been having recently with a bunch of people suing them and complaints about this. So I mean, this whole space is very complex. Really, it's about this entire transformation of search, enterprise and globally, that I think is a very interesting, challenging space. So we'll have to keep an eye on this one and see how that plays out.
Yeah, we weren't going to talk about lawsuits, but like Perplexity's dealing with lawsuits, Anthropic is dealing with lawsuits on the music side. Basically, everybody is still trying to figure out how much of their IP is actually in these models, and then what these models should do about it. And then it seems that in response, the LLMs are also coming in and trying to improve their capabilities to, if nothing else, make sure this probably doesn't happen again in the future. So, for instance, OpenAI has been coming out with its own acquisition announcements, finally starting to use some of that $10 billion they have from Microsoft and a billion of their own money, and whoever and whatever other billions are probably committed to them, based on what they're doing. So they've got Rockset for kind of database work and data management, as well as Multi, which seems like a bit more of an acquihire, but seems to be out there to help them with collaboration. So OpenAI realizes that they need to still do more to turn their models into tools. And they obviously have an idea of what enterprise applications are supposed to look like. And they obviously have daddy Microsoft or mommy Microsoft, whatever you want to call it, right there with them to help with that co-development and R&D and M&A strategy.
Yeah, I think there's there are two big takeaways in the TechCrunch article talking about their acquisition of Multi. It raised a few points. The first one that was sort of staggering to me is that they are estimated to hit over $3.4 billion in revenue this year, OpenAI. That's a shocking number, given really how sort of one-dimensional the product is at the moment. It's got a relatively limited use case. And it speaks very clearly to, I mean, we've talked in the past about they are clearly going after the enterprise, both directly as well as through their partnership with Microsoft, as are others of the frontier model set, trying to figure this out. And I think this is still early, wild west days, but that number actually shocked me a bit. But what I do think that this is indicative of, also combined, if you look at the Anthropic's release of Claude 3.5 Sonnet, with, I forgot what they call it, but they've introduced this new operating window that runs alongside your prompt and exchange, where you ask it to build something, it builds in this window where you can now interact with it, and it becomes this collaborative sort of like space that you're actually working with this AI model. And I think that all of these collectively are reflective of the fact that these foundational models are recognizing that they need to be doing more to make this operationalized, whatever, the ability to operationalize it. That organizations need to be able to do more than just ask a question. It's sort of like, it's like if you hired an employee and all they did is in the corner, like some sage, that you came up to ask a question, they gave you an answer, and that's all they did. It's like, well, that wouldn't be very useful. You wouldn't hire that employee. You want them to be able to do things. And so I think increasingly we're seeing that this entire shift towards agentic AI and AI agents is all about actually acting on it. And so I found it, Multi is interesting. We'll see if it just turns out to be an acquihire or not. But if they actually look at building in a collaboration platform of some form into ChatGPT or into the broader OpenAI ecosystem, could be really interesting. Is that a threat to a Zoom? I mean, that's what Multi was all about, right? I mean, could be really fascinating stuff. So I looked at all of that, and it was head scratching, or what's the Arsenio Hall kind of stuff that makes you go, kind of thing, more than,
Yes, they're obviously looking at the future. And to the extent that you can get two or more people to collaborate with an AI and ask questions and then create that multi-person contextual window and dialogue, that's an interesting capability, even if AI honestly doesn't get any better than it is right now. And honestly, with these large language models, we are seeing incremental improvements right now. We had this big thing that happened 2 years ago, and it was really impressive. And since ChatGPT 3, honestly, we've just been seeing little bits and pieces move forward. And that's honestly what we'll probably see for the foreseeable future. Maybe a couple of wow moments with video, but other than that, it's not like I'm expecting LLMs and analytics to suddenly bridge their gaps with each other completely over the next year.
Yeah, no, I think it is interesting. I think, going back to what we were saying, I think that all of this is indicative of this era where it's like, okay, we're sort of past that, wow, my gosh, it's shocking. And now
Mhm.
saying, how can we actually use this? And frankly, the Rockset acquisition, I don't want to downplay that, it's also a part of that story. It's all about how do I take my data, infuse it with this model, hopefully in a secure way, so that I can actually, make my world actionable, which we talked about last week with Apple's announcements, right? That
Mhm.
ability to drive context is absolutely going to be essential. So I think we're seeing all of this, that everyone is sort of recognizing that. And to your point, I'm sort of losing track of what we're talking about next, but to your point, right? I think we do have to recognize that we're probably past the point of seeing these explosive gains in LLMs. I mean, we say that in the next week there's going to be some crazy announcement that's going to change it all, but it certainly seems that that's kind of where how things are playing out.
Yeah, it feels like there's a new model every week and it's 0.2% better than the last one. So it now goes to the top of the heap on the leaderboard perspective in terms of these benchmarks that we have. But it doesn't really feel like a fundamental change in what's happening. We all have a general idea of how to use an LLM, which is in and of itself kind of a miraculous thing after 18, 19, 20 months. But
Well, and remember, that isn't true. That's true of people like us, but 80% of the world still hasn't even tried one or has only barely dabbled it, even with people like Meta putting it, into. So we are still super, super early days. That's the other part that I think is sort of confusing and conflicting, which is why I think there's going to be so much focus on how do we start putting this stuff into much more everyday use.
Right. So there's an interesting article that came out last week, and it was more of an editorial perspective from an MIT robotics professor, Rodney Brooks, probably best known for co-founding iRobot. Obviously, he also ran the MIT AI laboratory, CSAIL. So obviously a big wig in robotics and AI. And he gave a good warning in TechCrunch that AI is still somewhat overrated in terms of what we expect it to do. And part of it is that, frankly, this current generation of AI, this generative AI, is very good at being confident and making us think that it thinks like us. And I think it's good to have that warning from somebody who's in the know to remind us that although it is these things are answering in a way that we find very persuasive and personalized, it doesn't mean that the robot or the AI itself actually feels that this is a natural way of thinking.
Yeah, well, first of all, slackers like this that are so much underachievers really, annoy me. My God, these people are so smart. I can't even contemplate how they do all these things. Anyway, yeah, you know what? I mean, we've been saying this for a while, but I do love that somebody has this sort of credibility and stature in the industry is talking, brass tacks and reality about it. And look at his message. I think in the note you sent to me when you sent this article was that this was common sense, and it is. It's common sense. His message was use the right tool for the right job.
Mhm.
Gen AI is not the right tool. LLMs are not the right tool for everything. We've almost stopped talking about the fact that when the world now talks about AI, it has become synonymous with Gen AI, and there's a little diagram going around LinkedIn right now that shows sort of its place in the whole AI ecosystem, and it's just one little sliver, right? There's all these components, and there's an entire branch. It's all about predictive analytics or predictive AI. It's this idea of using the data to predict what's going to happen. And it has nothing to do with this idea of generative or language. It's about using this data. And we that is in many ways much more advanced, or at least much more, we've been leveraging those sort of machine learning models for a much longer period of time. And that's part of what he's talking about. It's like in a warehouse situation where I've got a data stream, I don't have all these variables, I can control the environment more, then it is not the most effective tool to use. And I think that we're as we're talking about this idea of agentic AI, or we're increasingly that we're going to talk a minute about this idea of mixture of agents. What we're going to see is the blending, right? That the solutions, the enterprises that win, are going to be those that don't get swept up in the hype, as we've seen some companies start to go to press with, right? And instead are saying, how can I take all of these tools? And I now went from having 10 tools to 1,000 tools, but how do I take them and assemble them in such a way that I can solve specific problems in the right way? And I appreciate companies like Zoho, I think, are taking a slower, more methodical approach to that. And I think that those are going to be the right combinations where we're bringing together the right pieces for fit for purpose and fit for use, right? These are the ITIL terms, but I think that that's going to really be the thing that drives it. And so I appreciate this article that it was just sort of calling a spade a spade.
Yeah, one of the things I liked most was his comparison at the end around the iPod memory and saying for a while we saw iPod memory double every year from 10 gigs to 20 gigs to 40 gigs. And based on Moore's law and the size of storage and all these other things, you could have expected that to double on forever. And in theory, we would have these petabyte iPods that are coming out in the near future. But the reality is there's only a certain number of songs that we actually need on an iPod or a phone, whatever you want to call it, no matter how much you might love music, you just don't need more than 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 songs. You don't need that next order of magnitude of 100,000 songs or a million songs. Or if you do, it's okay to access it off of the cloud or Spotify or other streaming services or what have you. That's what we ended up finding out, that there are limits to human comprehension and the human ability to actually digest anything. And that's probably going to hold true to some extent with everything we're doing with AI as well. There's only so fast that we can think and so much that we can both ask and understand at one time.
Yeah, no, I think there are lots of challenges. I also think, what I took from that part of the article was that Moore's law has conditioned us to think that we'll always see this sort of exponential leap in capabilities. But AI is a different animal, right? In part because we don't fully even understand how the darn thing works in some ways. And so there is a limit to the ability to sort of keep those exponential gains. And we've heard this from others in the industry, that we need to be continuing to explore other approaches, both within the general transformer sort of approach to this, as well as just entirely other elements of it altogether. And I think that is going to be the critical message. And as we've talked about, if you're an enterprise IT leader, you need to keep your options open. Don't get sort of sucked up into this. And I'm not saying don't experiment and don't invest, but just don't get all your eggs in one basket that you have to, talk about technical debt. The worst technical debt is one that you get everything invested here and then, next year something else comes out that completely changes the game and you have to try to undo all of that. So you need to have that sort of architectural flexibility into it, which is, I think, an interesting segue into another article that I thought was really, really interesting. It's actually, this is nothing production at this point. It came out of a group of research from a startup. So it is not academic research, but a startup called Together AI. And they are introducing in this paper two concepts that I thought were interesting. One is this idea of long inference models, and the other is what they're calling a mixture of agents. So we've talked in the past about mixture of experts, which is people like Databricks and Snowflake and others are taking this approach. But mixture of agents, at least if I'm understanding this right, and I'm curious your take because you have a more technical understanding of some of this stuff. But if I'm understanding this right, is basically taking these various, so when we talk about agentic AI, generally what we talk about is sort of what Emergence was doing, right? This orchestrator model where you put in a request, and this requester or orchestrator tries to decide what agent to go hand that off to go get done, right? And it's sort of this linear progression, this one-shot thing. And this idea of long inference models and mixture of agents, if I'm understanding, is effectively an iteration process where instead of simply taking that one-shot approach, it's effectively asking multiple agents the same question, taking their responses and using that as a foundation of iteration. And I looked at it sort of like crowdsourcing, or knowledge sourcing with a bunch of AI agents. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting approach. What was really interesting, because I forgot what it was, a few weeks ago, there was somebody else that had some similar sort of research, and it was incredibly expensive. And it was all about the security. It was a company, that's what it was, that was going to market. It was all about like validating the data. Well, this approach, while it appears to be more expensive, they're claiming it may actually, in fact, be cheaper because of the speed at which it's able to do it. So it was really fascinating to me. Made my head explode a little bit more than I could completely grasp, but it was really fascinating. So I'm curious what your take and read on all of it was.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting because it is paradoxically both more complicated and yet potentially cheaper by being able to figure out the right use cases for each agent that you might be interested in using at the end of the day. So I found that combination of that and then being able to have better call it attention by being able to understand conversations over longer, greater scope is very promising for AI, and just showing that a lot of the rules that we're thinking about for AI right now, such as a specific token limit or specific word limit associated with inputs or outputs, specific speed of response, as well as the accuracy of what you see from a factual or data-driven perspective. All this stuff is still a little bit up in the air. We talked a few weeks ago as well about a potential approach to change the actual mathematics behind an LLM from a more matrix-based approach to a more basic arithmetic approach. So when you put all these things together, you're starting to see a future where we can already see it now. There will be several or even many agents, and we're going to have some sort of orchestration and intelligence to figure out which agent is the right one to work with us at any given point. And honestly, what we have now is not what this is going to be looking like in 3 to 5 years. Just I can't emphasize that enough. Like 2027 version of AI is not going to look like what we are doing right now in the enterprise, period.
Not even close. And I think what's challenging. So there are two big challenges that I saw around all of this. To your point, this raised up yet again. I mean, we've probably done this 4 or 5 times in the 20 weeks that we've been doing this, where there's been something else. We go, this is a signal that there could be some change coming about how we look at this. We have that high rate of change, and yet we all know the enterprise doesn't change that fast. And so I think we have a bit of a potential for a whack-a-mole issue that by the time the enterprise gets to deploying something, that the technology has changed so dramatically. So I think that this is really going to introduce a real significant challenge for CIOs and other enterprise IT leaders to figure out how to build this, what I'll call it, the adaptability capability, the ability to move quickly without getting so invested in something that you can't change it, because it's going to be changing so fast, and you want to be able to seize that opportunity and not get yourself locked in. And I think that's going to become increasingly difficult with this, particularly if we see some major change. The other thing I think we're going to see is we also have a nomenclature problem here, right? We're talking about agentic AI, we're talking about AI agents, and what they're really talking about in this case is sort of the behind the scene agent. And then we also referring to AI agents as a interface, right? As the co-pilots or AI assistants that are often referred to as AI agents in some form. So I don't remember if it made our list, but for instance, Automation Anywhere just introduced what they're calling the AI Agent Studio, and then several companies are coming to market with different things that are calling some form of an agent, and we're gonna start having some confusion about what we're really talking about, right? So when we talk about the mixture of experts, these are basically the underlying models that are sitting within. When we're talking about agents, we're talking about effectively an encapsulated system, but it's still something that I would drop a prompt into or drop a request into that's going to then go do something. And this orchestrator is effectively an agent that sits on top of that. So you sort of have this architectural construct that sits below it, and on top of it is an interface of some form. And by the way, it's not just going to be prompt based. We're increasingly going to see all of this, both the predictive and generative elements, embedded directly into applications where they're acting on their own in some way, or at least not waiting for a prompt. We talked about that with Asana, and we talked about that. Well, somebody else had something, a WalkMe had theirs, where it's trying to be proactive. You have all these different pieces, and I think we're going to have a nomenclature challenge as we start trying to figure out what are we talking about with all of this. So I guess the selling point for this article is that this is really stuff that's happening sort of underneath the covers, that could have a dramatic impact on the quality of the response that we're getting.
Yes, we're going to have to figure out what is an engine, what is a query, what is an agent, what is the bot, and we're still working that out, but I think we'll get there.
You have more faith than me.
We'll see. Well, these things have a way of working themselves out. People usually don't choose the language that I would choose, but they usually end up choosing something. But I think that actually speaks to our last story of the day. Just looking at a recent Wall Street Journal article showing that work assistants need a lot of handholding still, possibly because we still aren't sure what we're quite working with when we are putting something into market, or we are expecting one thing and we get another, or we've been taught to expect the moon and the stars from AI, and now we're dealing with the reality.
Well, and I look at that makes it sound like, hey, they're not delivering what they promised, but it's I think it's simpler than that, or harder maybe, I guess, than that, and that is that all of this works great as long as I've got good data. It's all based. I mean, so this article basically talks about how CIOs are trying to deploy this and are running into issues, and the issues are almost universally based on the fact that their own houses aren't in order. And I'm not blaming anybody. I mean, I remember living those issues. These are challenges that have plagued the IT organization forever, right? Master data management, this ability of creating data libraries and being able to understand the data you have and reconciling it. And perhaps AI actually becomes the solution, where we start using AI for data cleansing activities and things to get our data in place before we start applying something like an LLM on top of it. But what it spoke to is the fact that a lot of the stuff that I won't even say that the Microsofts or the OpenAIs are promising, but what it doesn't take a huge step for anybody else to hear, to watch these demos, and then to make the own leap, is that, oh, I can just point this to all my enterprise data and start asking questions. What are my sales? What are my revenues? What are the projections? And that is all predicated on it having a contextual understanding of what all of this data means, which it doesn't, and B, that I've got good data to begin with, which we often don't. And so, and then 3, to understand it contextually within the flow of business, which is the process components, right? So you put all this together, there's a whole lot of lifting, which is why I think, going all the way back to where we started, all these all these funding announcements, you called them bridge companies, and it's these companies that are coming in to try to fill those gaps, trying to help solve those little pieces of this problem, because they're going to be what's necessary in the end to operationalize this and actually make it something that delivers consistent, meaningful results we can actually drive a business from. And that's what I think is interesting, and what this article is pointing out. So I don't know if it was naivete that there are a bunch of these CIOs that thought they could just drop this in and it was going to magically work, or if this article is just stating the obvious. But it wasn't a surprise to me, but it was still fun to read anyhow.
Yeah, so one of the things I find interesting about it, and I've said this before, but it reminds me a lot of IBM Watson, and where the real problems weren't that you couldn't replicate a Jeopardy-like setting, which was fairly complicated and used language and rules to beat the best human beings in the world at a specific game. But it was hard to create the completeness and veracity necessary to work with data in things like cancer or financial services management, and things that were not just rules-based options trading where just speed matters. When it came to judgment, that's where the likes of Watson struggled, and it wasn't because Watson didn't work. The problem was that the type of data and the type of quality that you were looking for was just not there and actually couldn't be created. And the people didn't realize that until they got into the specific problems that they were trying to solve. And I think we're finding the same thing with generative AI, that although it is fantastic at, I would say, grammar and understanding some basic structure from a drawing or creating some sort of overlay or overview of what you're trying to do, it's not necessarily good at the details, and it is not going to be good at understanding facts or judgment calls for things where there are no great rules. It is not good at understanding the impossible or the unimaginable, where we can take leaps of faith. AI is just not able to do it. Not just willing, but actually able to do it.
I also, so I mean, I look at this and there's a handful of lessons. I mean, like, I've said repeatedly, I use various models on a daily basis for all kinds of things to great effect. And my big takeaway is that it has to be intentional. I think simply giving somebody a blinking prompt and expecting them to use it is putting all the all the all of the impetus on them to develop that sort of use case. And I think for some that's going to be just fine. I think for a lot of people, they're going to need some direction. And this is where I'm becoming much more a fan of what I'll call embedded AI, where it is relying less on that person knowing what to ask or knowing how to ask it, and it is instead being embedded into the flow of work and delivering that information when and where it's needed, right? So, and that those insights. And so I think that that's going to be part of it. I think the other big challenge around this is that we have to start to that same issue of defining what those use cases in fact are. Going back to the article from Mr. iRobot, right? It's like not every use case makes sense or in the same way. And how do we then apply it? And I think a lot of organizations just sort of plowed into it. And this is where I will say, to a certain degree, shame on Microsoft, where they're just throwing this copilots out there. And it's like, okay, here, just go use this, and go spend $30 a user and have it have an assistant for everybody. And I don't think that's really the answer. That may be useful for some, but it's not going to be the answer for everybody. We need to be a little bit more directive around this. And so I think it's this sort of interesting period where the tools may be exceeding the capability of the enterprise to understand how to consume it at this point, and that needs to get realigned.
Yeah, and especially weird for Microsoft because Microsoft has its core Office suite, which is really only a few applications. And they know not to put 100 applications in Office because it would be way too much. But they haven't done that. They haven't consolidated their Copilot strategies yet. And once they do, it'll be much more interesting. But for now, it's still a bit of a mess.
Yeah, and that is the wonderful, messy world we're living in. But all that mess comes with excitement and fun stuff every week. And even in a slow week, we always find plenty to talk about. So if you're the CIO, we feel your pain, but also sort of envy your opportunity, because there is so much to be done here and so many opportunities to find ways to leverage this in surprising, interesting ways that truly can change the game for the organization. So go get them.
Yep. Couldn't have said it better. And with that, we're going to call it a week. Thank you for joining us on This Week in Enterprise Tech. Please like, please subscribe, please comment, please let us know what you thought and what we should look at for next week. Thanks a lot for joining us.